Well, here I am again discussing everyone's favorite big blue pile of mediocrity. Sonic has certainly seen great days, days, and everything in between. Honestly, it's hard to start a review of any Sonic game without mentioning this, since it's basically what the series is known for at this point, whether you're a fan or not. So when the Sonic Frontiers trailer started dropping in the summer of 2022, you might be able to guess how I reacted to some of the things I saw. I was not impressed, and frankly, I was pretty pissed. It seemed Sonic Team was well on its way to delivering us yet another forgettable experience that will be recognizable only through the memes calling out its incompetence. But while my thoughts were passionate and critical, they were anything but the majority. Some did share my sentiments, but I saw some overwhelming joy and anticipation for this game at the same time. I went back and forth on whether to pick it up at launch, but ultimately didn't, both for reasons directly related to the game and some having nothing at all to do with it. Those of you who've seen my most recent community post on the channel already know a bit about this stuff, so if you're looking for additional context, I'd recommend checking that out. Anyway, I finally got around to playing the game a few weeks ago courtesy of Steam's autumn sale, allowing me to swipe it for 60% off. And what did I think of it? Well, judging by the video's title, you probably already have some idea, but let's do what we usually do around here and start breaking the down piece by piece. This is my review of Sonic Frontiers. Before we get neck deep into the game's actual content, I want to cover performance and presentation. Mind you, I'm not starting with this section because I think it's the most important. I just want to get it out of the way early so we can move on. To start on a positive note, I love the minimalistic look of the menus and UI. It's much easier on the eyes than the cluttered menus and awkward color combinations featured in Sonic Forces, and it left a good impression on me as soon as I opened the game. I could have done without all the pop-ups happening during gameplay though. They're fine when introducing something for the first time, but some of them repeat way too often, especially for bosses, and you cannot skip them. They get annoying pretty fast. The game had pretty much no issues running at 60 FPS for my entire playthrough. Granted, I did play on PC, but my computer isn't exactly the strongest machine out there, so that qualifier doesn't mean too much. The only noticeable frame rate issues happened after dying, when the game would sometimes bottom out to 10 to 15 frames a second and would stay there until I either died again or reloaded my save. This didn't happen enough to frustrate me though, and when it did happen I was more confused than upset. Something that did frustrate me quite a lot, however, was the pop-in, and if you've played this game before or even seen footage of it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There is no way around it, guys. The pop-in issues in this game are absolutely horrendous. Horrendous. It happens everywhere throughout the game, all the time. Occasionally, I could ignore it, but it's just so widespread and severe that can only be an extremely short-term solution. The draw distance is handled in a rather rudimentary way, which makes spawning and despawning platforms as easy as just moving a few steps back and forth in pretty much any direction. In fact, entire chunks of level design can be completely invisible, leaving you wondering if there's something you're missing, only for the assets to appear in front of your face in the most jarring way possible. This naturally results in a game world that looks beautiful at times and crappy at others. When elements including textures, lighting, and shadows are popping in at less than a moment's notice, it's hard to stay fully immersed in what you're doing, if not outright impossible. And I'm not completely naive to the difficulties of handling a problem like this in an open world environment, especially one with a character who moves as fast as Sonic does. But here's the reality of the situation. If Sonic Team couldn't handle the challenge of designing such a game, they shouldn't have gone forward with it. It's not my responsibility as a consumer to lower my expectations because the development team's job is difficult. They aren't providing this game for free after all. They are charging money for it, so if the product doesn't hold up, then it doesn't hold up, and that's the end of the story. And this is the story with Sonic Frontiers. The pop-in is disgustingly terrible, and there's absolutely no excuse for how bad it is. Period. With that taken care of, let's get to the game proper. I think it's safe to say I'm not the only person who rolls his eyes every time a long existing franchise announces its next game is going to be an open world experience. Halo Infinite was a similar song and dance for me, and although I was excited for that pre-release, let's just say my eyes rolled back into my head, down my throat, and out my by the time I was done with that game. However, I don't have the same feelings towards Sonic Frontiers. This game has an expansive number of mechanics and gameplay elements at work, which we will get into, but the open world houses all of those things. My point being, if you don't like the open world, you're not going to like the game, regardless of what else might be operating behind the scenes. With that in mind, we must ask the extremely important question. Did Sonic Frontiers get the open world right? And I would say for the most part, yeah, it did. One important thing to point out right off the bat is this isn't exactly a standard open world experience. It's not completely analogous to Halo Infinite, Tears of the Kingdom, Elden Ring, Horizon Forbidden West, or any other game you'd prefer. All those games offer an open world experience, but none of them offer one with a main character possessing the speed and dexterity of Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic can absolutely blaze through this world, and I really mean blaze through it. He can bounce from objective to platform to objective to boss fight to cutscene to outer space and everything in between at extremely quick speeds. And this gets even better when you have the max number of rings pushing Sonic to blisteringly fast speeds and grabbing insane amounts of air, making traversal a total breeze. But what exactly is Sonic racing around this area to find? Well, all sorts of goodies are around, both small and large. Sonic can complete brief platforming challenges throughout the Starfall Islands to acquire pickups that increases attack power and defense, making combat more comfortable and in some cases a lot less stressful. By finding little creatures known as the Coco and returning them to a certain NPC, he can increase his max speed and ring capacity, making him even more resilient as he continues to explore. But Sonic's all-purpose technique in this game is called the Psy-Loop, which you have access to pretty much right from the start. It allows for interactions with certain symbols across the world to reveal hidden collectibles or unlock new pathways/shortcuts. It can also damage enemies and functions as a pretty much infinite source of rings, which might sound broken, but given how easy it is to find rings in this game, it's really not. The Psy-Loop is the backbone of this game's exploration, and chances are if you're feeling stumped, using it is probably your best bet. For an open world to be immersive, it needs to pique the player's interest and convince the player to actively seek out seemingly interesting locations without necessarily being prompted to do so. And while Sonic Frontiers is no doubt pretty obnoxious with in-game tutorial pop-ups and suggestions, particularly in the early game, it does allow a great deal of flexibility and player agency once you get past the tutorial area. There are giant towers and massive structures to climb and conquer, massive bosses that are clear and obvious attention grabbers but don't force you to interact with them, large landmarks such as the huge volcano on Chaos Island, etc. Some things you'll come across pretty quickly that aren't so massive are what I like to call mini-map challenges. They're plastered all throughout the world, and completing each one reveals a small portion of the map along with any relevant locations or collectibles within that area. If this sounds like typical Ubisoft cookie-cutter open world design, that's because it is, but I'd argue it's not as bad here. Most of the challenges can be beaten in under a minute if you know what you're doing, and completing all of them or even the majority of them is not required for obtaining any critical information. That can be done pretty much solely through visual examination. The only times I relied heavily on the world map were when I was trying to hunt down a large number of a specific type of collectible I needed, and I wanted to bounce from item to item as quickly as possible to cut down on unnecessary backtracking. While playing Sonic Frontiers, I wasn't always thinking about what collectible I needed to continue as much as I was just cruising around the game world taking on new challenges as my mood dictated. You can really go at your own pace here, and you aren't forced to interact with a bunch of shit you don't care about due to a lack of options. In that sense, this game's open world's about all you can ask for. However, there is one thing you can discover in the open world I have not talked about yet: the cyberspace levels. Once Sonic crash lands on the Starfall Islands, he hears a disembodied voice telling him he needs to
find the Chaos Emeralds, destroy the Titans, Tear down the walls between dimensions.
Yeah.
To get the emeralds, Sonic needs to collect portal keys to unlock the vaults containing them, which are earned by completing cyberspace levels along with completing specific objectives within each level. But remember how I said Sonic Frontiers gets its open world right for the most part? Yeah, they didn't get the cyberspace levels right. They didn't get those right at all. Alright, let's just get into it. The cyberspace levels are the absolute worst part of this game. There's just nothing they do particularly well, but plenty they do horribly. In a nutshell, they're just standard point A to point B levels more akin to what the series is known for. You finish the stage, then you go back to the open world. But these levels do nothing to complement the open world they exist in tandem with. They feature bland and uninspired mission objectives that never get more complex than getting a certain number of rings or finishing a stage within a certain period of time. There are red star rings to collect, but usually it's easier not to get these since many are just mindlessly placed onto the one linear pathway you have to travel on regardless. These stages don't offer unique experiences from one another, and as soon as you play the first one, you know what you're getting every single time. And this isn't helped by the fact the developers didn't even bother to construct unique locations for these levels, but instead chose to reuse the same tired-ass locales this franchise should have let die 10 years ago. I am not being hyperbolic when I tell you at least 80% of the cyberspace levels I completed were either Green Hill stages, or stages so similar to Green Hill any difference was completely negligible. And I'd say another 10 to 15% were other locations this franchise can't seem to let go of, including Chemical Plant and Sky Sanctuary. But it's not just the locations themselves that are reused to an asinine level. I swear some of this level design is ripped straight out of Sonic Generations. I got a massive feeling of deja vu while going through some of these sequences, and after looking back at the Green Hill levels in Generations, it only seemed all the more obvious. It's not surprising most of these levels clock in at under 90 seconds, even for more unskilled players. I mean, why the f would these levels be long when they don't have any original content as a basis for their existence? Even the level design that isn't ripped from other games doesn't do anything to be memorable or ambitious. As I approached the end of the game, I was actively avoiding the cyberspace levels. Not only were they pathetically underwhelming, they also took me away from the expansive open world which I was actually enjoying at the time. But you might ask, Frost, if you were avoiding the cyberspace levels, how did you get enough portal keys to get the Chaos Emeralds? 4 words. Big the mother cat. This might be the only appearance Big makes in this series where I actually like him being around. I always considered him a mediocre addition to Sonic Heroes, and the less I say about his god-awful fishing stages in Sonic Adventure, the better. In this game, you can find Big hanging out at fishing spots across the islands as you travel. If you trade him purple coins, he'll let Sonic borrow one of his rods to go fishing where you can find all kinds of things other than just fish. Seriously, you can find entire treasure chests down there, and I can't help wondering how many fish died slamming full speed into them. You're awarded tokens based on the quality of the animals or things you retrieve, which you can then sell back to Big for other collectibles such as attack/defense boosts, rings, experience points, and you guessed it, portal keys. It's worth noting, Big carries a limited supply of these, so you can't just go fishing for an hour or two and then buy an effectively infinite supply. And I really only used this technique on the last island of the game. For the first 3, I played through a healthy number of cyberspace levels, not because I was enjoying them, but because I believed that maybe if I just kept giving them a chance, I would eventually warm up to them. But unfortunately, that just never happened. They started off and they ended The strange thing is, I know why the cyberspace levels were included in this game. They were included to keep some semblance of the traditional Sonic formula around for the sake of making the open world transition more smooth. And frankly, this would be fine if the cyberspace levels were actually worth a damn, but they're not. So where does that leave us? Well, I don't know about you, but I know where it leaves me, and that's incredibly unimpressed. Some things that didn't leave me unimpressed, though, were Sonic's control and combat prowess, along with how these elements mesh with the level design of the open world. In terms of how his actual physics are programmed, Sonic has seen all kinds of different styles, ranging from the incredibly loose and slippery physics of Sonic Heroes to the borderline insane level of precision in Sonic 06. Sonic Frontiers finds a happy medium, you could say. Sonic can pick up speed extremely quickly, especially with max rings, but there's still a gradual elevation of speed that keeps it from feeling like he's teleporting all over the place. His double jump is consistent, meaning it doesn't awkwardly cancel out your momentum like it does in some other games, and his air time allows for crossing great distances as long as you know how to take advantage of his air boost. This game has plenty of genuinely interesting and creative level design that forces the player to understand what Sonic's limitations are, to maximize his potential without straying off the path in confusion. This was probably the gameplay element that concerned me most before I played, aside from my obligatory open world skepticism. I wasn't a fan of how so much of the level design seemed suspended in the air when I saw the initial trailers for the game. But after playing, I will freely admit I was wrong about this one. The elevated platforms and routes are what make most of the game's best platforming moments possible at all. Of course, this also depends on how you alter Sonic's properties to suit your playstyle should you desire to do so. You can pause the game at any time to access a substantial number of sliders to change how Sonic controls. These include his initial boost speed, his turning speed, both boosted and unboosted, how quickly he decelerates after jumping, etc. You can also change the camera speed and distance, but I didn't mess around with those too much personally. After finishing the first cyberspace level, I wasn't thrilled with how Sonic's movement felt. He seemed incredibly heavy, as if his ego had taken a physical form and were actively weighing down his body. I went to the menu and tweaked some things, then came back to the level to test out his movement again. Afterward, I felt a lot more comfortable with Sonic's control and felt more capable of predicting how he would interact with the world around him. The combat system has been expanded from previous titles as well. Okay, expanded is probably a nice way to put it. After all, this series hasn't had a playable character with a developed fighting moveset since the Werehog in Sonic Unleashed, and he isn't exactly a unanimous fan favorite. Sonic's moveset here, however, is fun enough to play around with and dissect. He still has the homing attack available, as always, but that really only works consistently against the weakest enemies in the game, many of which are just footstools for platforming and not enemies built for any sort of prolonged confrontation. Against tougher foes, you'll have to rely on his other attacking options. You'll have access to loop kicks, long-range projectiles, mid-air spirals, heavy stomps, etc. alongside the standard basic melee combos. The enemy variety in this game is above average for an open-world game, I'd say, although some of their strategies are more annoying than challenging. You can't take down every foe in the same way, and many of them can outright ignore your combo attempts or punish you hard if you attack at the wrong moment or if you choose the wrong attack. My only strong criticism of the combat system, excluding boss encounters, is how long some of the animations are. It's not so much that any one animation takes too long on its own to execute, but more the slow accumulation over time. After you fought hundreds of enemies, watching Sonic do a mid-air loop for the 235th time is pretty tiresome. And since we're on the topic of combat, we may as well talk about the bosses. I can say without a doubt, these are some of the best bosses in the entire history of 3D Sonic. I love that Sonic Team listened to community feedback about Super Sonic being relegated to final boss encounters. In this game, you get to control him several times as you clash with massive titans rivaling those from the Metal Gear series. These fights are massive, wonderful spectacles that almost feel like cutscenes despite you still being in control. I enjoyed fighting all of them, but my favorite would have to be Knight. I loved the challenge of having to redirect its shield back into it. This not only requires positioning Sonic correctly to have a chance to line up the shot in the first place, but also anticipating which direction Knight will move and how fast to lead the shot appropriately. Even that is nothing compared to the ending though. Watching Supersonic slice Knight clean in half with its own sword literally made my jaw drop, which is not something that happens to me often. It left the lasting impression a boss fight should. There is one boss fight that seriously drops the ball, but I'll get to that a bit later. Although if you've played the game, you probably know which boss I'm talking about. I can't properly address that boss fight until we cover the story, since it provides some important context. Sonic and his friends crash land in a place called the Starfall Islands while pursuing the Chaos Emeralds, which they believed to be in the area. Sonic is pretty much fine after the impact, but his friends aren't so lucky. They get partially trapped in a digital dimension known as cyberspace, where they can see and hear everything that's happening in the real world and are fully aware of it, but can't physically interact with anything within the real world, including Sonic himself. Using advice from a disembodied voice, since that's always a great idea after all, Sonic sets out to destroy massive constructs across the islands called Titans with the goal of severing his friend's connection to cyberspace and returning them to the real world. While this is all happening, Eggman is stuck in cyberspace too, but eventually escapes with the help of his AI companion Sage, whom he refers to as his daughter despite treating her like a freshly made pincushion half the time. Sage observes Sonic as he explores, telling him his defeat is inevitable and defeating the Titans won't change his fate or that of his friends, but Sonic ignores this for the most part. Honestly, it's hard to blame him since Sage spends most of her time talking in metaphors that don't reveal any useful information whatsoever. Sonic defeats the Titans, but the stress of interacting with cyberspace takes a heavy toll on his body and mind. He fights it off for a long time, but eventually gives in and becomes trapped in the void between cyberspace and the real world. This forces Sonic's friends to sacrifice their physical forms to return him to the physical world so he can finish what he started. It's around this point Sage reveals she was the one who imprisoned Sonic's friends within cyberspace, not out of malice, but to protect them from the inevitable end she believes is coming. As Sonic interacts with his friends over the course of the story, he learns more and more about the Koco, a strange race of creatures who live on the Starfall Islands, as well as the ancients who used the Koco as vessels to hold their thoughts, feelings, and memories in the event their race was wiped out. Wiped out by what, you ask? That big purple moon, that's what. Yep, that weak-ass looking space rock is the final boss of the game. This final boss is shitty. Like, really shitty. Seriously, what in the was Sonic's team thinking here? How did anyone think this was an acceptable way to end the game? It's just a boring shooting simulator that goes on for way too long, and sometimes the end shoots so many projectiles at you that avoiding all of them is effectively impossible. And if you get hit 3 times, you have to do the entire thing all over again, while listening to the same cliche villain dialogue play on every single attempt.
I am inevitable. I cannot be denied.
It's ridiculously bad. This is easily one of the worst final bosses in the entire series, and one could definitely argue it's the absolute worst. This boss has zero, and I mean zero, redeeming qualities. It is that terrible. But as awful as the boss itself is, the build up to it feels like its own false marketing campaign. Sage insists at multiple points in the story that the end cannot be defeated and Sonic is guaranteed to lose to it even under the most favorable circumstances.
All we did was chase it out of its shell. It's retreating into space to regain its true form. Even Supersonic won't be able to stop it. He helps those he is at odds with. He is quick to make peace. Perhaps... No. I have run the simulations. They are doomed.
Yet when the final boss comes and the goal you spent the entire game working toward is revealed, it doesn't amount to anything more than a version of a 1980s arcade game. It's just baffling how many mistakes were made here. I could go on ranting, but I think you get the point. I could also go into more detail concerning specific events that happen from one cutscene to the next, but I won't, partly because it would make the video way longer than it needs to be, and partly because it wouldn't add too much content anyway. There is an interesting dynamic between Sonic and Tails, where Tails comes to realize he'll never reach his full potential if he doesn't learn how to fix problems without Sonic, or Sonic helping Knuckles realize there's more to life than just guarding the Master Emerald until he dies, but these character arcs aren't exactly new to the series, so they aren't really worth diving deep into. If you want to know more, I suggest getting the game and playing through it for yourself. Anyway, Sonic defeats the End, but it attempts a last-minute suicide attack, forcing Sage to fly in at the last minute to contain it, dying in the process. Well, kinda. She dies in the original ending, but the DLC is a bit different. It's not exactly a secret the original ending of Sonic Frontiers left something to be desired, both for the story and the gameplay. Releasing DLC to clean up some of the game's blemishes was an obvious next step for Sonic Team. Not only are Tails, Knuckles, and Amy now fully playable, each rocking a unique moveset, but the tail end of the narrative was rewritten to include them in a far more significant way. In this alternate version of events, Sage reverses the sacrifice of Sonic's friends to restore their physical forms and uses her own power to slow Sonic's deterioration due to cyber corruption instead. Consequently, Sonic's friends have to face the cyber corruption in his place and are far worse off for doing so. They still collect the Chaos Emeralds though, with a little help from Mustache Man, and Sonic takes off to defeat Supreme just like he did in the original ending. After Supreme dies though, we get an actual final boss fight. This fight is no joke, 100 times better than the original. Incredible scale, incredible stakes, and incredible satisfaction. The camera kinda sucks since the trees in the background are constantly blocking your view of Super Sonic as well as incoming projectiles, making it difficult to tell when you need to guard sometimes, but I suppose nothing can be perfect in a Sonic game. Sage doesn't die in this version of the ending, instead returning after the battle to live peacefully with Eggman, leaving the door open for a sequel where their relationship will likely be gone with the wind. While the DLC does a lot to improve the story, the changes to the gameplay are what really makes it worthwhile. Sonic's friends have such different playstyles from him, it often feels as though you're playing an entirely different game in the best way possible. They each get a unique benefit for holding max rings, with Tails getting to pilot his Cyclone at will and Knuckles having access to an infinite glide along with increased gliding speed. And as broken as Tails' Cyclone is, I mean seriously, it turns even the most sophisticated platforming segments into a total joke, Amy was definitely my favorite character to play as. She's giving up quite a lot of speed to Sonic, no surprise there, but she has access to an incredibly precise triple jump, allowing her to achieve insane levels of verticality Sonic could only dream of. She's also got a hovering ability enabling slow descents to easily land on small platforms. I can't help wishing the progression from playing as Sonic in the main game carried over directly, specifically his stats. All of Sonic's friends start with their attack and defense stats at level 1, and all their skills have to be unlocked from scratch. I can understand this for the more useful upgrades, but why do this for the Psy-Loop or the most basic melee attacks? These changes make most mini-bosses in the overworld effectively unkillable unless you spend the time necessary to grind up every single character's stats. Though in the game's defense, I did jump right into the DLC immediately after playing the base game, so if I'd taken a break, this may not have been so frustrating for me. But even then, the skill trees in this game are more like skill lines, so it's not like you can put a ton of effort into developing your character a particular way. Having to unlock all the skills with each character individually produces a lot of unnecessary tedium into the experience. I recognize these design choices were almost certainly motivated by the large number of players claiming the base game was too easy even on the hardest difficulty. For what it's worth, I played the game on hard mode and only died a few times outside of falling into bottomless pits. The only times the difficulty caused problems for me were during the trial challenges, and that was more due to artificial difficulty spikes than any sort of genuine design changes. Seriously, these trial missions suck. I hate it when game developers create challenges that are only difficult due to 90% of your previously available options being taken away. And that doesn't consider how most of these trials are just rehashed groups of enemies from the base game. They don't introduce anything you haven't seen before and honestly just should have been left out of the game. That said, the DLC was an amazing addition to this game. It added roughly 5 to 7 hours onto my total runtime, and for a completely free DLC, that's far more than you should ever be asking for. And I might as well talk about this now since there wasn't really a better opportunity to do it before, but this game's soundtrack is f***ing amazing. Guys, I cannot get enough of the music in this game. Let's just say I've listened to I'm Here a few more times than I care to admit. I've also gotten a ton of joy from Undefeatable and Bloodflow. The instrumental tracks are just as good as the vocal ones, as they really capture the atmosphere of the world Sonic is exploring without being overly simplistic. If that wasn't enough, the game also offers a jukebox for rotating through songs at will, many of which are returning tracks from previous games. I don't know about you guys, but it's hard for me to imagine something more epic than zipping around the open world while listening to Live and Learn from Sonic Adventure 2. I don't normally talk about music in my reviews since I consider it one of the most subjective and therefore one of the least useful evaluations of a game, but I got so many thrills from the soundtrack I couldn't let it go unappreciated. Sega's attempt at an open world Sonic game came together well, but not without its bumps and bruises. This game is a good time for sure, but even with the improvements brought forth by the DLC, it doesn't quite reach that Game of the Year type of quality the developers were no doubt aiming for. That being said, it did surpass my expectations, and there's a good chance it could surpass yours too if you're still on the fence about getting the game. I'm not sure I would recommend it as someone's first Sonic game though, since it's definitely not one of his easier adventures in terms of platforming, even with the in-game control tweaks taken into consideration. I do truly believe a sequel to this game could be a masterpiece, as well as one of the best Sonic games ever made. I know that's a lofty claim, but I stand by it. But ultimately, that depends on whether Sonic Team decides to stick with this formula going forward, or if it's just another one and done type of situation. With Sega, you never really know until you know, so all we can do is wait and see. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.